Thank you so much, Dana, and welcome everyone to the latest installment of NCN's ongoing webinar series. It is a privilege that I've been asked to moderate this webinar on behalf of NCN today. I've been, for the past few months, contributing to NCN's work in an advisory role and helping them advance their activities and their work. And it's a great honor today to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Casey Lozar. As many of you already know, Casey is a longtime student and advocate of Indian country economic and community development. He currently serves as a vice president at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, and within that role as director of the Center for Indian Country Development. I first met Casey roughly 5-6 years ago when he was in his previous role at the state level, where he served as an administrator and tribal policy advisor for the state of Montana and directed the state of Montana's Tribal Economic Development Commission. In my former role working with the National Congress of American Indians, we had Casey on a extraordinary panel of Indian country thought leaders on tribal economic development at an NCI annual convention, and Casey's going to be touching on many of the same issues that we discussed that day during his presentation today, as he shares about the center's work to date, its role in Indian country, how it works with Indian country, and what it has planned moving forward. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Casey Lozar. Casey, welcome.
Excellent. Thank you, Ian Lamlams. Hasquahalt, Trumneti wit schoolets quest, Chinas sailors school say, cool and chump conejo. It's wonderful to be with everyone today. Good afternoon. My name is Casey Lozar. I'm an enrolled member of the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes, and I'm from the Flathead Indian Reservation in Western Montana, and I get to do this work within the Minneapolis Fed and the Federal Reserve, based out of the Helena branch, so just a couple hours away from my home community that we go back and forth to quite often. So it's a privilege to be invited to talk a little bit today about the Center for Indian Country Development, who we are as a resource, as a good partner, and as a sort of champion for accessible research and sort of data inclusion in Indian economic development. I do have to mention, as a member of the Federal Reserve, and I do anticipate translating this statement, this disclaimer, into Salish, so I can just get through it in Salish, that these views today are not the views of the Minneapolis Fed or the Federal Reserve System. They are my own views. So I really wanted to start with a little bit of context, because I think the Federal Reserve is often misunderstood, and I want to be able to create the context of why we have a Center for Indian Country Development, why we do this work, and why this matters to the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Bank. So as many of you may know, the Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank, and we've got many different responsibilities and roles that we play in ensuring that our economy is strong and is stable. So we as a system provide financial services to lending institutions, to banks, deliver cash and coin, and process checks. We're also the fiscal agent for the United States government. We regulate and supervise a series of banks, along with a couple additional regulators, the FDIC and the OCC. And probably where you know us the most is our role in conducting monetary policy. And we really have a dual mandate to do that job well. So we're managing price stability, or managing inflation, so that our economy is sound and solid, And we're also working to maximize employment, which is very important to our work at the center. And we accomplish that by ensuring that all those who are willing to work can work. The system is developed. We've got a board of governors in DC, and then we have 12 reserve banks across the country. I'm an employee of the Minneapolis Fed that you can see sort of in the Northern Plains. We have 6 states in our district, and the Center for Indian Country Development is associated with the Minneapolis Fed. And we are really driven at the Minneapolis Fed by our mission, particularly as it relates to Indian country. And that mission is that we are pursuing an economy that works for all of us, including Indian country and Indian people. Just about 7 years ago, after probably 25 years or so of the Minneapolis Fed doing good work in Indian country, really starting with addressing redlining issues in tribal communities, to taking on efforts and initiatives around legal infrastructure and helping to establish Indian business alliances. We committed to Indian country when we established the Center for Indian Country Development. And our mission at CICD is to make sure that Native nations can prosper, and that we are adding value through actionable research, policy development, coalition building, and just collaboration with community members, policymakers, tribal leaders, etc. And our vision is really that we're doing the work that will allow tribes to unlock their full economic potential. And maybe more sort of specifically, our kind of core goal, our core objective is to see that tribes are able to support the capacity development to really accelerate economic prosperity in their communities, and to support a growing and a stable private sector in ways that tribal governments see fit. As we know, there's a significant heterogeneity across Indian country, and so it's going to look different from tribe to tribe. We are a national center, and while we're headquartered at the Minneapolis Fed, we work all across the Federal Reserve System with other reserve banks, and with the Board of Governors, and with tribes in all parts of the United States. And we serve as kind of the catalyst, the connector, a bridge builder between Indian country leaders and policymakers. And we are guided in part by our staff, certainly. We've got a growing staff here at the Center for Indian Country Development, but certainly guided by the expertise and guidance of our leadership council. Of our leadership council, which is made up of about 12 individuals who are elected leaders in Indian country or experts on a variety of different economic topics in Indian country. And I really want to underscore the important role that the leadership council provides in a direction building for the center. So as a research and a policy institute, we work very hard to ensure that all of the research that we conduct internally or in partnership with tribal communities or in partnership with other economic researchers are informative in many ways as we think about policy change and policy development around economic policy in Indian country. And so you can see sort of the variety of research that we do on the bottom right here of the screen. We conduct surveys and analyze policies and programs. We conduct our own applied research and create data tools, all with the purpose to do a combination of informing or educating and deepening understanding of tribal economies, influencing the opportunities that exist in economic prosperity, and then transforming economic policy through bringing together stakeholders to envision changes, adjustments, developments that might support Indian country economic development. As certainly as it relates to sort of how we think about sort of the buckets of our work at the Center for Indian Country Development, starting at the highest level, the outcome we hope to play a role in is that tribal governments can provide those public goods that they see fit to support sort of long-term economic prosperity. So our research is not, and our efforts are not looking at next quarter or next year or even 10 years from now. We want to be able to provide insights that and data and data analysis that will inform economic development for decades and decades to come. We certainly are, as a research institute, we have great diversity in the breadth and depth of our research. We listen and learn from tribal organizations, tribal leaders, policymakers on the particular items that they find interesting as it relates to unanswered questions in Indian country, and we use our research to help advance and improve policy discussions. And more at the granular level, which I think is important in understanding the center, we have a focus on maximizing the contributions of tribal enterprises and enterprise diversification, as well as supporting those tribal small businesses. Optimizing tax authority. Tribes have never relinquished their tax authority, which is a critically important source of government revenue. Grow the efficacy and the utility of existing policy interventions for financing and tax tools in Indian country, and then a little more in the short term, ensuring that our work is helping to mitigate those effects of the pandemic that we all have felt over the past couple of years. I wanted to talk a little bit about our research, and I think the main thing that we work hard to do at the Center for Indian Country Development is conduct research that doesn't live on a shelf. This research that we do is intended to deepen understanding of issues and opportunities in Indian country and inform both the policy decision at the tribal government level, at the local level, all the way through the federal level. So all of our work is driven by insights from our leadership council, from other tribal stakeholder groups, certainly is based on available public data or proprietary data that we have access to, is sort of filtered out as it relates to its connection to potential policy understanding and policy change, and is packaged in ways that is accessible to a wide variety of audience, both in Indian country and outside Indian country. And I just have a few examples that I pulled just more recently from our website, from recent publications that we've done. And you can kind of see the range of the research that we've done. Some of that work is sort of survey-based, like that the doing business in Indian country example on the top left, a survey analysis on the bottom left of the COVID-19 impacts in Indian country. There's a series, there's some research or publications that we've done on interviews with tribal leaders, analysis of labor market conditions. On the bottom right is an example of a data set that we're building through public data and private data on tribal enterprises and their growing importance in the development of tribal treasuries, and then tribal government's ability to provide the public goods that are important to them. So our analysis and our research is certainly varied, but it's really anchored to and should be informative to policy development at all levels of government. The other sort of role that we play as a resource to you and a resource to tribal citizens and policymakers and tribal leaders is making what available data is out there in this data desert that we sort of operate in Indian country, but packaging and leveraging and accessing that data to make it more user-friendly for policymakers, for grant writers who are really doing a lot of the heavy lifting in economic development. A couple examples here. Just last year, we created a Native American labor market dashboard. Certainly, we've heard from tribal leaders about their concerns about not having real-time information on Native workers. And so we have a dashboard where you can make comparisons on a key labor market statistics or indicators across non-metro and metro areas in Indian country. And it's become a really important tool, I think, for the United States. Another item that we've developed and will be updating here in the next year or so is the Native American Financial Institutions Map, which is essentially us trying our best to put Native CDFIs and financial institutions on the map with data to help tell sort of the narrative of ownership on CDFIs, size of CDFIs, and to some degree impact. And then lastly, we've developed using existing ACS and American Community Survey data and HMDA data, some additional analysis at a reservation level so that community leaders can quickly, without having to go through a number of survey reports, quickly assess some of the key indicators in their communities. So these are examples of the data tools that we're trying to make access to data much easier and increase its utility and use. One of the things that, as I mentioned, sort of drives our work is listening and learning from tribal communities and being engaged to sort of open pathways for sharing best practices, learning, informing policy. And I won't go through every one of these details here, but certainly we've done surveys throughout the pandemic that were helpful in understanding real-time effects. We leverage economic researchers and tribal leaders to review some of our research before it goes to publication. So there's an Indian voice and Indian eyes on our work. We certainly convene stakeholders, often on a wide variety of topics. So just at the end of last year, we had our first annual research summit, which was a success as it relates to bringing economic researchers and tribal leaders and practitioners together to listen in and learn from each other. We are often called as an independent institution. We're often called to provide testimony in, Senate Committee on Indian Affairs or Senate Banking or in other hearings in state legislature on some of the key policies and research that we do. We've done a lot of work too, and I'll go into a little more detail on a Community Reinvestment Act in Indian country. We certainly partner with our Leadership Council members often and get guidance on long-term strategic efforts as well as participation in a lot of our work. And we contribute often to these types of conversations with key institutions like Native CDFI Network, serving on panels in conferences and helping to elevate both the really great things that are happening in tribal economies and also to identify some of those systemic barriers that hold back our economies. I do want to underscore this sort of long-term and strong relationship that the Center for Indian Country Development and the Fed has had with Native CDFIs. We certainly see, and we see in the data, we hear in the anecdotes and the discussions with our friends within the Native CDFI community that Native CDFIs are really key contributors to addressing issues around access to credit, consumer credit, business credit, and providing those financial services that we as Indian people need to be able to expand opportunity in our communities. Some of you might remember the center did a survey of over 39 CDFI, native CDFIs back in 2017 to try to understand the limits and the potential of the growing native CDFI field. And certainly some of those outcomes you're very aware of just in your day-to-day work, sort of the variability or diversity in the services and products that you offer across a variety of geographies. One thing that you likely feel most native CDFIs feel on the daily is just the limitations on capital pools or capital resources. There's certainly not a limitation on clients, but there is on capital. And then the questions and concerns about how to staff and build staff capacity native CDFIs. I would encourage you all, if you haven't seen it, to go on our website and read a piece of research that we did in partnership with a few other economic researchers on native CDFI's role in improving credit outcomes in Indian country. Some really data-driven analysis that underscores your lived experience of the impact that you're having on credit and the important role that your community ties with your customers plays in improving conditions in your local communities or in your market. We were a key player in bringing together over 100 Native American financial institutions on my home reservation about 3.5 years ago, to create sort of this a growing network of a learning community of sorts to identify some best practices, ways to leverage capital in a collaborative way. And then maybe many of you will remember, we partnered with the Native CDFI Network last year to elevate the important role of Community Reinvestment Act and our efforts at the Fed to modernize that in partnership with other regulators. And I wanted to spend just a couple minutes on CRA and modernization and Indian country, because I know it's particularly important to you, and it is to the Federal Reserve. And for those of you who are not aware, essentially the CRA requires us as the Fed and the FDIC and OCC to encourage financial institutions to meet the credit needs of communities, including our tribal communities. And it really serves, the Community Reinvestment Act really serves as kind of a bit of the bread and butter of our community development work across the Federal Reserve System. And it is an important tool to encourage and incent lending institutions to do the type of work that we need done in Indian country. We are going through that process right now of modernizing the Community Reinvestment Act, which has been around for 40 plus years, 45 years, and it has only had a few edits to it. So it's a really important time for Indian country and for the regulators to get this done right. So we're really working to update these standards, given lots of changes in the banking industry, to make sure there's additional clarity for lending institutions and for community participants. And our role at the Center for Indian Country Development as sort of a national resource across the system is just making sure that Indian country and key stakeholders are aware of CRA and are informed about some of the considerations that and questions that we've posed to get feedback on how to do this work well in a way that will be supportive of credit and capital financial service needs in Indian country. Very soon, the Federal Reserve and the other two regulators will be publishing a notice of proposed rulemaking. And we will begin to partner with folks like Native CDFI Network and other key Indian country stakeholder groups to, again, review the NPR, to pose the questions we want to hear feedback on, to inform the final rule. And that all of this work will then conclude with sort of a kickoff of education and implementation efforts so that your communities, your institutions are well aware of CRA and how it operates. I do want to kind of conclude some of my remarks with an exciting announcement that we shared with the public at the end of January, that the Center for Indian Country Development is growing, and we're growing our capacity to do what we set out to do 7 years ago, and that is to drive and deliver public benefit through a long-term data initiative. And while we are still working through all the specifics of how we will deliver that additional public good above and beyond what we're doing from the research, policy, and convening realm, we know that we will be generating new data that's important to economic development. So that could be through surveys on any economic and financial data, or some of the data that is particularly important for Indian country. Partnering with tribes on tribal data projects. We've certainly heard a lot of feedback that individual tribes or consortium of tribes are interested in understanding opportunities and challenges in their economies, and we hope to partner with tribes in that way. Doing more work around the creation of those data tools. Being a translator to publicly available data to make it more accessible for Indian country, as well as, with additional data, being able to add to our portfolio of policy-oriented research projects. So certainly exciting time at the Federal Reserve, exciting time for the Center for Indian Country Development. I have to underscore that we have currently 7 new career opportunities at the Center for Indian Country Development. So I encourage you to visit our website and to learn more. So with that, Ian, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have or members of the audience might have.
Thank you so much, Casey. That was a very informative overview and very welcome news on the Community Reinvestment Act and the modernizing of the regulations. As you know, the attempt that was made during the previous administration was very promising, with close to 70 mentions of Indian country, specific mentions of Indian country, and particular incentives to try to get the CRA to actually work for tribes where it has failed so miserably to date. Definitely looking forward. I think everyone on this call is looking forward to working with the CICD once that new NPR drops, and that we collectively get out in front of the game on that and make sure that Indian country's voice is heard. We encourage everyone, if you have questions for Casey, please place them in the chat and we'll get to them in order and get through as many as we can. And I assume Casey will be available via email for any additional questions that we can't get to during the hour we have together. The first question says, how does the Fed's regulatory activities over big banks differ from that of OCC and FDIC? It seems that banks will not do the right thing unless they fear serious repercussions from the regulators.
So that's a good question / comment. I think as it relates to sort of regulation, and I'll probably respond in the context of CRA and CRA modernization, is that one of the goals in CRA reform is incentivizing banks of all sizes to provide the financial services and the credit that is needed in our tribal communities. That could be for retail lending, that could be for lending to businesses, for major community development projects that are important in Indian country. And so when you think about the different sizes of the banks, we want to make sure that the CRA is encouraging banks to partner and invest in Indian country, regardless of their location, regardless of their size. And I think that certainly, I think we're pleased with the process that we went through last year at the Fed, where we had an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, and we received a pretty significant portion of the overall comments were correlated to Indian country. And so that's been particularly helpful to get not only the opportunity to engage across 4 or 5 different convenings with tribal leaders and tribal institutions to sort of inform them of some of the questions that we have, but actually having that translate into the type of comments that the Fed and the regulators can really understand to make a final rule. So I think the work here is work around delivering the financial services that we know haven't been delivered in ways that Indian country has hoped for the past several decades.
Thank you, Casey. Early on in your presentation, you touched on the COVID pandemic, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you see CICD's role relative to the pandemic moving forward. I know that, and everyone here knows that the pandemic shock, the economic shocks of the pandemic persist. As you mentioned, they don't manifest themselves the same across tribal communities. The paths that tribal nations choose for recovery and economic transformation out of the pandemic are going to be different. So how do you see, as the center expands and brings more people on board, how do you see the center's role in informing, tracking, and supporting Indian countries' economic recovery and transformation?
Absolutely. So one of the things we did, right, a couple of weeks after the pandemic hit the United States we started a survey to understand sort of the effects of the pandemic immediately in Indian country. And we kind of looked at a couple of different institutions. We looked at the effects on tribal enterprises, on tribal governments, and specifically on revenues and labor market. And we did that for a number of reasons. One, we wanted to be able to help tell the story of the disproportionate economic effects, but we also wanted to do our part in trying to close the data gap in Indian country. So often our tribal leaders, they do such an incredible job of telling the story of our tribal economies, but oftentimes, particularly in situations like we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, there isn't data to help tell or complement the stories, the lived experiences in Indian country. So we did a lot of that work early on. I think we conducted over 5 surveys. I think they were really helpful in understanding current conditions. I think going through that process for us was certainly informative because we had a lot of policymakers seek out some of this data and data analysis. And it sort of strengthened our understanding that much more needs to be done to close the data deserts that exist, particularly around economic outcomes, credit, and diversification in Indian country. And that work has really driven our proposal to expand so that when tribes of varying experiences and varying economic strategies will be able to have the data to sort of come out of the pandemic in a good way, but to grow, particularly with the historic level of funding that's come through the United States government, make those kind of informed decisions with these resources to sort of strengthen the foundation and stability of tribal economies. So we will continue to do what we can to either create new data sets based on needs of Indian country, or again, sort of advocate for higher quality and stronger sampling of surveys where existing data is located now for a wide variety of economic measures in Indian country.
Thank you for that, Casey. So we have a question from Julia Nelmark. And Julia, are you able to come on screen, turn on your mic and ask your question directly, or if you prefer, I can do it for you.
Sure, I can do so. Casey, we struggle. We've got a native CDFI here within MMCDC, and we struggle with gaining the leverage to facilitate our work, especially with many of the tribes being in rural areas rather than the population density that a lot of programs seek to get the most impact. So how could the center assist other federal agencies to understand the importance of updating their policies and regulations to more effectively work in Indian country?
Julia, that's a great question, and that is it is another sort of arm of our capacity and our growth that we want to invest some of our expertise and our relationships in the sense that we want to be able to assess and analyze some of these federal policies or some of these federal programs that either may be earmarked specifically with tribal set-asides, or that may be accessible to tribes, native CDFIs, tribal enterprises, et cetera, to really understand, are they reaching their intentional goals as it relates to Indian country? So for example, we are currently working on a project to assess the New Markets Tax Credit Program, which is a tool that you all probably are well aware of, to just understand to what degree is this program penetrating Indian country, and to understand, is it, and if it is, and there are certain communities that are doing a much better job in accessing that, what are the characteristics for those communities that we can learn so that the program can be improved to allow other tribes to see the same kind of benefits from that, from in this case, New Markets Tax Credits. So that is absolutely a part of our sort of research agenda. Certainly it requires a lot of strong relationships with the federal family and access to data, of which the Federal Reserve has longstanding relationships with a lot of federal entities and data agreements that are linked to proprietary data. And we hope to do that type of work to sort of dispel some of the concerns, the myths, or the realities of these tools that could be truly leveraged to expand tribal private sectors or to support significant investments in economic infrastructure, to make sure that they're doing those in effective and efficient ways.
Great. If I could add two more questions then. So I ran our New Markets Tax Credit Program for 15 years. So I'm very familiar with that. And one of the biggest issues with bringing the impact of that program into Native American areas is the program, even though it's a relatively new one, it has gotten so competitive that new entrants into it are so behind the eight ball, it's almost impossible to get into it. And so some of us in the industry are promoting a set aside for Native American allocation, which would help to somewhat overcome that barrier to entry. But also then I would love to have someone really unwrap how the CDFI fund is applying that set aside. They're requiring the set aside to go to only projects on federally recognized reservations. And for example, we have a project that we're working on in Minneapolis with 90% Native American customers in a healthcare facility. does not count towards that set aside because it's not on a reservation. And then on the other hand, we have financed a project on a reservation by white people for white people, but it counts. So that's not the best metric. I know they struggle with how to apply it, but if you're looking for some industry input, I would be glad to input there.
Julie, that would be wonderful if you want to provide additional details. And maybe this is a really good opportunity to sort of underscore where the center adds value, and that is analyzing existing data to understand the conditions and to propose potential policy considerations. And practitioners and institutions like yours will be really helpful in sort of rounding out what policy change could look like to make sure that those programs are working effectively. So this combination of, as I mentioned earlier, your lived experience as it relates to those sort of programmatic barriers and the data that suggests how the program is operating will help tell a more comprehensive story for how these resources can be better utilized in travel economies.
Great, thank you. My other question on a totally different tact has to do with broadband. And I know there's a lot of money going out to broadband right now. Some of the communities, ours locally here, for example, they're putting out RFPs to the service providers. And so those service providers are choosing where to use the money for the investment rather than not necessarily going to where it's most needed. And so they're getting, they're trying to focus the work on the population areas versus getting out into the rural parts of the rural counties or states. And so, and the broadband service providers tend to go to the easiest technology to implement that will only work 5, 10, 15 years. They're not investing in the most long-term technology because it costs a little more money and they don't have to. So there are a number of organizations with technology, information, and data around this, but and a lot of maps, and of course the state's maps are so slow and bogged down, they need a technology upgrade themselves. So this problem is not going to be addressed by the current funding they're looking at by a long shot.
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion around broadband in Indian country is a top priority because it has its tentacles into sort of our everyday life in terms of supporting education. We certainly learned quickly in the pandemic that Indian country was a struggle to be able to make sure that our young people could continue learning, to establishing e-commerce in tribal communities, to access new markets, et cetera. And so broadband is particularly important. We know from recent work that we've done at the center that the speeds don't compare even to nearby sort of rural communities. If you're in a rural reservation community, the costs are significantly higher, and that things like structural barriers like permitting processes really slow down sort of innovation and increase of high-speed internet in our tribal communities. So I know this is a particularly important issue that we will continue to research. I guess I'm hopeful, truly understanding how complex broadband is, that just between the CARES Act and the ARPA, that tribes received over $33 billion and have the opportunity to sort of envision how either the creation of their own service provider companies or partnering with service provider companies to be able to bring the type of broadband that is experienced in urban areas to our tribal communities. And I think, from our perspective, our continued research to put data on the table to help tribes become more informed about how they want to proceed in broadband will be particularly important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So we have a question from Jeremy. Jeremy, did you want to ask your question directly, or did you want me to do so on your behalf?
Oh, sure, Ian. I'll ask Casey directly. Hey, Casey. My name's Jeremy Braithwaite, and I work as a researcher / evaluator, and I contract with some native CDFIs, and one client that I'm working with now is, they're sort of struggling to, or sort of grappling with the question of how do we evaluate some of the investments that we're making. And, hearing some of the projects that you've talked about in this presentation, I'm just curious, what are some important lessons that the Center for Indian Country Development has learned sort of along the way as you have engaged with tribal peoples and communities on some of these different research projects and studies that you've done, sort of knowing the complications of doing the logistical, the political, and otherwise complications of doing research in Indian country? What are some lessons that you've learned along the way that you would impart to native CDFIs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think first and foremost, starting at the highest level, is that when the center goes out to begin spending our time, our resources, our capacity to really make sure on these research projects that they are going to be meaningful to individual tribes or Indian country in general. And I think that sounds very simple, but there is an endless amount of research or endless amount of unanswered economic questions in Indian country. But in order for us to make our work of the highest utility, it's our sort of philosophy at the center that it needs to be really anchored in what tribal leaders find to be the most important or the most critical to help inform their decisions, or to inform policymakers at state and federal levels as well, to seek the types of economic opportunities that I think we all hope to see in Indian country. So really making sure it's anchored to the lived experience. Kind of going down sort of a next level, one of the things that we've done in many of our research projects, maybe most of our research projects over the past couple of years, is either our internal researchers or our research partners will have a research project that is anchored to Indian country insights. And then before we publish, we have authors conferences. In fact, right now, there's an authors conference going on a water rights piece of research that the center has been working on with others. And we bring in to these authors conferences, tribal practitioners, tribal leaders, to, if need be, pump the brakes, right, on certain observations, or to urge a deeper inquiry of those that are participating in the research. And I think that has been really helpful, again, to make sure we're keeping the research sort of on track. And then I think more generally, one of the lessons learned, and I think we are becoming better at it at the center, but it is hard, is the creativity to apply the existing data that is publicly available over the complex jurisdictional boundaries across Indian countries. So often when you look at available public data, it's down to census tracts, down to counties, but that's not how our jurisdictions in Indian country operate. And so that's one of the key lessons learned for us, is getting better at figuring out how to tell the story within jurisdictions that are not exactly matching with tribal jurisdictions. And it's not easy, but I think it helps to be more precise in our analysis of sort of the effects of economic conditions on reservation, in tribal lands, and just off, so that we can use that as comparators as it relates to the effectiveness of access to credit, effectiveness of federal financing and tax tools, et cetera.
Thanks so much, Casey. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy. So Casey, I had a related question on that, and it involved one of your final slides where you were talking about the CICD's expansion plans and some of the things you're either going to do that's new or expand upon some of the activities that you've already engaged in, and that's specific to the partnering with tribes on tribal data projects. As you know, the fundamental challenge that tribes have faced for so long is not having access to or ownership of current quality local data that they can use to inform strategic decision-making by tribal leaders and others in the community. Can you provide maybe a little bit deeper window into some of the kinds of data partnership projects you might see the center engaging in with a specific tribe or a group of tribes that's based on their needs?
Yeah, that's going to be particularly important as it relates to delivering the public benefit that we hope to do with this additional capacity. And that is, you're spot on, Ian. There is this disconnect between high quality local data and sort of local decision making. And I think one of the most important things for the Center for Indian Country Development is to make sure first and foremost that that we have strong tribal partners who want to collaborate and envision projects that will be data related, that will be important to them. And sort of anecdotally, we've heard from tribal leaders, just particularly around over the time period of the pandemic, an interest and need to own their own census data. So creating their own tribal censuses, or doing their own surveys of credit, skill gap, workforce needs that are specific to their communities that you can't find in national survey data, which doesn't necessarily link American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders to a specific affiliation with a tribe. We've heard from tribes about the importance of understanding home ownership and mortgage financing issues and needs. And so those are maybe a few examples that certainly we've heard in the more recent past would be areas where tribes might find interest. I also think there are some themes that we've heard across tribes, and it's one of our hopes to establish a data project or even a survey with a consortium of tribes who want to opt into a partnership to explore sort of a multi-tribe data project that might focus on sort of how tribes are using their treasuries to deliver public goods, and understand like what are those public goods that are being delivered, what's the budget goals for delivering those public goods, and where might those deficiencies be as it relates to getting a tribe where they want to be in 20 years in terms of its economic infrastructure and services they want to provide their community constituents. So I think it could really run the gamut. Certainly for us, it will take time to do this well and to do it right, and to find that balance in between the two things we hear from Indian country is we need more data and we need to protect our data sovereignty. And so finding that balance in partnership with tribes on meaningful projects, I think will allow us to be helpful to tribal leaders seeking to stabilize and grow their economic prosperity.
Thank you, Casey. We have time for one more question, and we have one more question. So Dave Castillo, if you wouldn't mind turning on your mic and putting Casey on the spot.
Yeah, no, thanks, Casey. I appreciate your presentation. Financial institutions hold tremendous power. I think Wells is at 2 trillion, Fannie's at 4 trillion, much more so than tribes or native CDFIs could ever wield. So in that context, and given the state of affairs in Indian country, and beyond what you can help do at the Center for Indian Country Development, what realistic outcome do you believe we as native CDFIs can, practically have good outcomes for and request of conventional financial institutions to improve tribal economies? Is there something that you think we should really be asking for with good prospect of getting financial institutions to make good on?
Yeah, Dave. This is a really important question as it relates to opportunity for tribal members, businesses, and tribes. I think there has been, and you're well aware, and I shared a few examples of the incredible success and impact that native CDFIs have in your particular markets. You can't argue with the success. So I think one of the key things is continuing to figure out ways to tell the success story of native CDFIs to get a bigger audience about the impact that you guys are having. There are approximately 70 native CDFIs in the country, and 574 tribes, other indigenous communities. 70 native CDFIs, however effective and however large your capital pools are and your staffing and your resources are, will never be able to be the single source of support for credit and financial services. And so, the traditional lenders are going to play a really significant role, and they should play a significant role. And I think we're seeing some success stories of the traditional lenders beginning to partner a little bit more with native CDFIs. But I think it really comes down to relationship building. I mean, using the native CDFI model of how you're successful in your communities. You're in community. You understand your communities, your community needs. I think the traditional lenders have a lot of work to do to understand both native communities, but also native CDFIs. And I would hope that as we think through those objectives I shared around the Community Reinvestment Act reform and modernization, that those efforts create more opportunity for capital sharing investments in key institutions like native CDFIs, and to incent those traditional lenders to essentially be at the table, because native CDFIs absolutely cannot do it alone, however successful you are.
Thank you, Casey. Really appreciate that. And that's the line that's going to stick with me, is you can't argue with the success of native CDFIs. We may have to use that here or there in NCN's work. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share with us, and look forward to partnering with the center on a number of activities and fronts. And certainly when the CRA NPR drops, we're gonna be rushing to you and saying, okay, how do we make sure that the powers that be understand the current state of affairs of Indian country, and how a CRA that actually pays attention to Indian country can make a world of good. So with that, I'd like to close this out and remind folks that this is the latest in a series of webinars that NCN puts on, and that we'll be having a couple more coming up in the near future. So stay tuned to your email, and you'll hear more from us about the next ones in the pipeline. So with that, we bid you good afternoon and have a good weekend.